Welcome, fellow wanderer of the night, to the quiet story, most often left untold, the man behind the legend, the steady hand beneath the cape, the conscience that kept the darkness from consuming everything it touched. Tonight we explore the complete and unsparing life of Alfred Pennyworth, soldier, performer, guardian, and father, in every sense that word can carry without the legal documentation to confirm it. So settle in, let your breathing slow, and let the candlelight of Wayne Manor's long corridors guide you gently towards sleep. There is no need to hold on to every detail. Simply let this story find you in the dark. Close your eyes when you are ready, and let us begin. The name Pennyworth carried weight before Alfred was old enough to understand what weight meant or to decide whether he wished to carry it. It was not a name that appeared in newspapers or on the facades of buildings, not a name that commanded rooms or redirected the course of public events. It was something quieter and in certain respects more durable than those kinds of names, a professional name. A name associated with a specific and exacting standard of service that had been built across generations through consistent demonstration rather than declaration, that existed in the particular form of reputation that grows not from ambition, but from accumulated evidence of excellence in things that most people prefer not to think about. The Pennyworths served. They had served for as long as the specific relationship between the Pennyworth family and the Wayne family had existed, and that relationship had existed for long enough that Alfred himself could not have identified with certainty the moment at which it had begun. His father, Jarvis Pennyworth, served Thomas Wayne's father before either Thomas or Alfred had reached an age at which the nature of that service could be understood as the complex thing it was. Jarvis was, by the accounts that Alfred had absorbed across a childhood spent in close proximity to his father's professional example, a man of extraordinary competence and remarkable self-possession, someone who had mastered the specific art of being indispensable without becoming visible, of attending to everything that required attention without drawing attention to the attending. The Wayne household that Jarvis served was the Wayne household at the height of its social and civic influence, the family at its most expansive and most publicly purposeful, and the demands that such a household placed on its most senior domestic professional were demands that required genuine capability rather than mere compliance. Jarvis met these demands with the consistency that distinguished professional excellence from mere competence, and the specific standard he established was the standard that Alfred internalized as the natural baseline for what it meant to do the work well. Alfred grew up inside this professional world without being entirely of it, occupying the particular position of a child who belongs to a household without belonging to the family the household serves, who understands the domestic rhythms of a great house from the inside without having the domestic rights that would normally accompany such understanding. He knew Wayne Manor in the specific and intimate way that children know the spaces in which they spend their formative years, knew its acoustics and its drafts, and the particular quality of its light at different hours, knew which floorboards announced a visitor's approach and which could be crossed in silence, knew the kitchen at 5 a.m. and the drawing rooms in the full elaboration of an evening reception. This knowledge was not acquired deliberately but absorbed, in the way that environment shapes the people who occupy it, and it would prove unexpectedly significant decades later when the question of maintaining that environment in circumstances that its original occupants could not have anticipated fell entirely to Alfred's management. The tradition of service that Alfred inherited through his father was not, it must be understood, the service of diminishment, not the submission of a person's capacities and dignity to another person's convenience, which is what service, at its worst, produces. It was something that the English professional culture from which it emerged had managed, in certain expressions and in certain households, to develop into something approaching a vocation, a calling with its own demanding standards, its own specific ethics, its own form of dignity that was grounded not in the subordination of the self, but in the mastery of a complex and important practice. The person who maintained a household like Wayne Manor at the level its occupants required and its reputation demanded, was not performing a lesser function than those whose achievements occupied more visible registers. They were performing a function whose complexity and whose consequences for the people depending on it were as significant as most of what passed for important work in the worlds that the households they served inhabited. Alfred understood this early, and his understanding of it was the foundation of his lifelong relationship to excellence, the conviction that the quality of work was not determined by the visibility of the work, that precision and care and the sustained commitment to doing things properly rather than adequately were moral choices as much as professional ones, that the person who attended to the small things with the same seriousness they brought to the large things was building something that had genuine value, even when that value was invisible to those who benefited from it. This conviction would remain with Alfred across every context in which he operated, including contexts that bore no surface resemblance to the professional tradition in which it had been formed. Because Alfred did not go directly from his father's example into his father's role, he made a choice that must have required a specific quality of personal clarity to sustain against the weight of family expectation. And that choice took him far from the corridors of manor houses and into environments whose demands were entirely different from anything the Pennyworth tradition had prepared him for. He enlisted in the British Army, and the Army, specifically the units to which his combination of capabilities and aptitudes eventually directed him, did something to Alfred that polished silver and managed estates and attended to the social mechanics of Gotham's upper registers could never have done. It taught him what violence looked like when it was systematic and when it was not. It taught him what human beings were capable of doing to each other under pressure and what they were capable of enduring. It taught him that the world contained forms of urgency and forms of consequence that domestic professional life never encountered, and that a person who had only ever operated in the latter was genuinely unprepared for the former in ways that no amount of intelligence or professional competence could compensate for. His service extended beyond the conventional dimensions of military life into the territory of intelligence work, the specific and demanding discipline of operating in environments where the boundaries between official sanction, individual judgment were deliberately blurred, where the information you possessed was more valuable than the physical capabilities you brought to bear, and where the maintenance of functional appearances in the face of operative realities that bore no relationship to those appearances was not merely a professional skill, but a survival requirement. Alfred learned tradecraft in its most complete sense, not just the technical skills of surveillance and counter-surveillance and secure communication, but the deeper psychological discipline of sustained operational performance, the ability to be consistently something in public that bore a controlled relationship to what one actually was, to manage the gap between external presentation and internal reality without allowing that gap to destabilize either. This was not deception in the ordinary sense. It was a form of professional identity management whose sophistication Alfred would eventually deploy in a context that would have struck his intelligence colleagues as improbable if he had ever been in a position to describe it to them, which he was not. The specific psychological demands of intelligence work shaped Alfred in ways that proved deeply consequential for the life he would eventually lead. He learned to carry information that could not be shared, to make decisions whose rationale could not be explained, to maintain relationships that were organized around what could not be said as much as around what could. He learned the specific weight of secrets, not the romantic weight that popular culture attributed to secret keeping, but the actual weight, which was the weight of sustained vigilance against the possibility of inadvertent disclosure, the constant management of what one communicated through behavior and expression as much as through language, the particular form of cognitive labor involved in continuously monitoring one's own outputs for anything that might reveal what needed to remain concealed. This was exhausting work, and Alfred became very good at it, and the specific competence he developed through years of its practice would define the quality of his performance in a role that required him to maintain an enormous secret for decades in a domestic environment where the people most likely to notice the relevant behavioral signals, were also, in most cases, the people he was most determined to protect. The theatrical training that Alfred undertook during a period that fell between his military career and his eventual assumption of the role he would occupy for the remainder of his life is often noted in biographical accounts of his history, but rarely examined with the seriousness it deserves. Alfred spent meaningful time not merely attending theatre, but participating in its production, learning the specific craft of physical transformation and character embodiment that stage performance demands at its most rigorous, developing the ability to inhabit a role so completely that the distinction between the performer and the role becomes operationally irrelevant to the audience, and ideally to the performer as well. He learned what actors learn about the construction of credible identity, that identity is a performance in the most literal and specific sense, that the signals through which others read who we are manageable signals rather than fixed ones, that the person who understands the mechanics of identity construction has capabilities of self-presentation available to them, that the person who has never examined those mechanics does not. This understanding, combined with the identity management skills of his intelligence career, gave Alfred a specific and unusual competence in the territory where self and role intersect, the territory that would eventually be occupied by his management of the gap between the public identity of Bruce Wayne, Gotham's philanthropic billionaire, and the operational identity of Batman, the city's masked vigilante, and the private reality of the damaged and extraordinary person who inhabited both. Alfred's theatrical training was not incidental to this management. It was one of its primary technical foundations, the understanding of how performance worked, giving him tools for analyzing and supporting Bruce's performance that no amount of simple loyalty could have provided. The circumstances that brought Alfred back from these varied professional experiences to Wayne Manor that reactivated the Pennyworth obligation to the Wayne family at precisely the moment when its activation would require the full deployment of everything Alfred's unconventional path had taught him were circumstances that no one had planned and that Alfred himself had not anticipated. The deaths of Thomas and Martha Wayne in Crime Alley on a night when their son was 8 years old and Alfred was still finding his way back toward the family obligation he had deferred but never entirely relinquished, changed everything about the situation into which Alfred was returning. He was not returning to serve a flourishing household at the height of its social engagement. He was returning to serve a traumatized child in a grief-saturated house, to maintain the fiction of normality in circumstances that had rendered normality inaccessible, to perform the functions of parental care without the parental authority that might have made those functions cleaner and simpler, and in every respect, less morally complicated. He brought with him into that role everything. He was the tradecraft, and the theatrical training, and the military competence, and the professional standard inherited from his father, and none of it had specifically prepared him for what was coming. No preparation could have. What was coming was singular. The man who walked through Wayne Manor's doors to assume his obligation to the family's remaining member was not the Alfred Pennyworth of the images that eventually accumulated around his name, the silver-haired figure of unshakable composure, the gentle ironist whose relationship to the darkness around him was one of cultivated equanimity. He was younger and more uncertain, and carrying his own losses alongside the professional responsibilities that had reasserted themselves at the worst possible moment. He was a person who had chosen unusual paths and then been redirected by circumstances onto a path more unusual than any he had chosen, and who was now required to find within the combination of everything he had been and everything he had learned the specific resources that this specific situation required. He would spend the rest of his life discovering that the combination, while not adequate to every demand the situation would eventually place on him, was more adequate than anything else that could have been brought to bear, which was fortunate because it was all there was. The night of the Wayne murders has been told and retold in so many forms and from so many angles that it has acquired, in the telling, a quality closer to mythology than to history. The pearls scattering across wet cobblestones, the child kneeling between his parents' bodies, the moment of absolute rupture between one world and another. These images are accurate in their essentials and insufficient in their totality, because the story of that night and its consequences is not a story about a single child in a single alley. It is a story about a household, about a network of relationships and obligations that the murders did not destroy but transformed entirely, that the absence of Thomas and Martha Wayne did not erase but reorganized around a new and terrible center. Alfred Pennyworth was part of that household. He was present in its life and its functioning in ways that made him, in the most specific and concrete sense, a person who lost something on the night of October the 26th. Not the same thing that Bruce Wayne lost, because no other person in the world lost exactly what Bruce Wayne lost, but something real and significant and permanently altering. Alfred's relationship with Thomas Wayne had been built across years of professional proximity, combined with something that the professional framework of their interaction had never been quite adequate to contain. Thomas Wayne was the son of the man Alfred's father had served, which meant that Thomas had been a presence in Alfred's awareness from a period that predated Alfred's own professional service, a figure observed from the particular angle available to the child of a household. Employee, which is an angle that reveals things about a person that the more conventionally social angles do not. Alfred had watched Thomas Wayne grow from a child of privilege into a man who had, through choices that were genuinely his own, rather than simply the expected expressions of his class and his circumstances, become someone who took seriously the obligations that his resources created. Thomas Wayne's medicine was not the medicine of professional advancement. It was the medicine of a person who had concluded that the skills he had developed were most meaningfully deployed in service of the people who had least access to them, and who had organized his professional life accordingly. Alfred respected this, not because it was admirable in the abstract, but because he had watched it be chosen, specifically and repeatedly, against alternatives that would have been more comfortable and more socially rewarded. And watching a choice being made across time gives it a weight that knowing about a choice as a completed fact does not. The affection Alfred held for Thomas Wayne was not the simple, uncritical regard that devotion could produce in less clear-eyed people. Alfred was constitutionally incapable of uncritical regard. His intelligence training had made him a person who noticed things, who assembled observations into patterns, and assessed those patterns with the professional detachment that effective intelligence analysis required. And this capacity did not disappear when its object was someone he cared about. He saw Thomas Wayne clearly, including the aspects of Thomas that were more complicated than the public philanthropist image, suggested the impatience that his high standards sometimes generated in the people around him, the occasional failure to recognize that the intensity of his commitments could be experienced by those closest to him as a form of absence, even when he was physically present. Alfred saw these things and held them alongside the genuine admiration, and what he felt for Thomas Wayne was, therefore, not idealization, but something more durable and more honest, the affection of a person who knows the full picture and chooses to value it in its completeness. Martha Wayne occupied a different but equally significant position in Alfred's internal landscape. The household that Alfred served was not simply Thomas Wayne's household. It was the household that Martha Wayne had shaped the specific domestic culture that her particular combination of aesthetic sensibility and organizational intelligence and genuine warmth had created in Wayne Manor, giving it a character that was distinct from the character of either spouse individually, and that disappeared entirely when she did. Alfred understood households in the specific way that people understand systems. They have spent years maintaining understanding, not just the visible surface of how things worked, but the underlying logic, the specific decisions and preferences and habitual choices that had accumulated into what felt, from inside, like simply the way things were. He understood Wayne Manor as Martha's creation in a way that no casual observer could have. and the loss of that creation of the particular living intelligence that had shaped and sustained it was a loss that Alfred felt in the daily details of his continued management of a household that no longer contained the fruit, person who had made it what it was. Bruce, at 8 years old, was, in Alfred's direct observation, a child of unusual intensity, not unusual in the way that the eventual mythology of him would suggest, not already visibly proto-heroic, or marked by destiny in any way that a thoughtful adult observer could have identified as such, but unusual in the specific and more modest sense that his engagement with the world had a quality of complete attention that most children of his age and circumstances had not developed. He noticed things. He asked questions that revealed that he had been thinking about their subjects for longer than the questions implied. He was capable of a stillness that most children of his energy and his circumstances could not sustain, a capacity to wait and observe that coexisted with the physical restlessness of a normally developing child in ways that made him, to Alfred's experienced eye, genuinely interesting as a person, rather than merely lovable as a child in one's care. Alfred loved him in both senses. The lovable as a child dimension of that love was straightforward and unremarkable. The interested in him as a person dimension was the one that would eventually sustain everything. What the murders did to this child that Alfred knew, the specific transformation that Crime Alley worked on, the person Alfred had been observing and caring for, was not immediately visible in any single dramatic symptom, but was legible to Alfred across the subsequent days and weeks and months in the accumulation of small, specific changes that someone who had not been paying Alfred's quality of attention might easily have missed. The stillness that had characterized Bruce before the murders became something different afterward, not the stillness of a child in watchful engagement with the world, but the stillness of a person who has withdrawn behind a surface that has been deliberately made difficult to penetrate. The questions that Bruce asked became fewer and more guarded, as though the experience of the alley had taught him something about the relationship between asking questions and receiving answers that made the activity seem less worthwhile. The directness of his attention, that quality Alfred had found so striking before, remained but turned inward in a way that made the person on whom it was directed feel observed from a greater distance than before. Alfred managed all of this while simultaneously managing his own grief and the extraordinary logistical complexity of the aftermath, the legal proceedings, the estate management, the institutional responses that the deaths of prominent citizens inevitably activated, and the continued functioning of a household that had lost the two adults for whom it had been maintained. He did these things concurrently, without the luxury of addressing any one of them with the full attention it deserved, which is the specific condition of crisis management in its most demanding form, and he did them without anyone to manage them alongside him, which is the specific condition of Alfred's life in its most characteristic expression. He was, in those early weeks and months, performing the functions of grief and of professional responsibility and of parental care and of institutional navigation simultaneously, in a house that had been designed for a family and that now contained one 8-year-old boy and one middle-aged Englishman who was trying to figure out what any of it meant and what any of it required. The decisions Alfred made in this period about how to structure Bruce's care established the patterns that would govern their relationship for the rest of its duration, and those decisions deserve attention. Not because they were obviously right. Many of them were not obviously right, and several of them were of questionable wisdom by conventional measures, but because they were made deliberately with Alfred's full awareness of the alternatives available to him and the specific reasoning by which he chose what he chose over what else was possible. He could have sought institutional support for Bruce's grief therapeutic intervention of the kind that the professional literature of the period was beginning to develop and that the Wayne family's resources would have made easily accessible. He chose not to, partly because his reading of Bruce's character suggested that certain forms of therapeutic engagement would be counterproductive for this particular child, whose grief had already taken a form that was not going to be redirected by conventional means. and partly because Alfred's own instinct, formed by his intelligence background and his theatrical training and his careful observation of people across a career spent in their close proximity, was that what Bruce needed most was not professional management of his grief, but the sustained presence of someone who knew him and would not leave. Alfred did not leave. This is, when measured against the full weight of everything that not leaving eventually required, among the most significant decisions any character in the Batman mythology ever made. And it was made not in a single dramatic moment, but in the daily renewal of a choice that the daily circumstances continued to make more demanding. He stayed in Wayne Manor in the weeks after the murders, when staying meant managing a house full of grief and legal complexity with no adequate support. He stayed in the months after, when staying meant watching a child's personality reorganize itself around a wound that Alfred had no certain means of addressing. He stayed in the years after, when staying meant becoming the primary human relationship in the life of a person who was in the process of becoming something that Alfred, with his specific background, could recognize, and whose recognition filled him with a complex mixture of pride and dread. He stayed through everything that staying eventually required, because he had assessed the situation clearly and concluded that the alternative to his staying was a situation for Bruce that was worse, and that assessment held for the duration of his life. What the years of raising Bruce Wayne in the aftermath of the murders required of Alfred is a subject that deserves significantly more attention than it typically receives, both in the accounts of Batman's origin that focus on Bruce's development, and in the accounts of Alfred's character that tend to present him as already formed in his role, rather than as someone who was figuring out the role in real time, while the role's demands continued to expand beyond what anyone had anticipated. Alfred had professional training in many things, but not in the specific thing that was now required of him, which was the primary care of a profoundly traumatized child in circumstances that were likely to produce, rather than resolve, the specific direction in which that trauma was developing. He was not a child psychologist. He was not a family therapist. He was not a person who had thought carefully in advance about the relationship between early childhood loss and the formation of what would eventually become the most elaborate vigilante identity in the history of urban crime fighting. He was a man with unusual skills, doing his best in a situation that his best was not always adequate to address, and the honesty of that inadequacy, the degree to which Alfred's best efforts did not prevent things that Alfred would have preferred to prevent, is part of what makes his story genuinely significant, rather than simply moving. He provided structure, because structure was the thing most immediately available to him, and because his professional training had given him a specific appreciation for its value, the way that routine and order and the predictable sequencing of daily activities could create, in conditions of chaos and grief, a surface of manageable reality on which more demanding psychological work might eventually become possible. Wayne Manor, under Alfred's sole management, became, in the years after the murders, a house of remarkable regularity: meals at consistent hours, maintenance performed according to schedules, the domestic rhythms maintained with a precision that the circumstances might have seemed to render unnecessary, but that Alfred understood to be essential, precisely because the circumstances had rendered so much else unreliable. Structure was what Alfred could offer. He offered it with everything he had. The period of Bruce's early adolescence brought with it the first clear evidence that the direction of Bruce's development had moved beyond the range of outcomes that conventional responses to childhood trauma could be expected, to produce the first visible signs that what was forming in this child was not a version of grief that would eventually resolve into ordinary adulthood, but something more specific and more permanent and more purposeful. Alfred observed this with the clarity of someone who had been paying very close attention for a very long time, and his response to what he observed was neither simple approval nor simple alarm, but the more complicated response of a person who understood, with professional precision, exactly what he was looking at, and who had not yet resolved the question of what to do about it. He carried that irresolution forward across the years of Bruce's preparation, making the thousand small decisions that the situation generated, while the large decision whether to support or redirect what Bruce was becoming remained insufficiently resolved to provide clear guidance for any of them. The influence of Alfred's particular background on the specific shape of Bruce's development is something that the standard accounts of Batman's formation consistently understate. Bruce did not develop his capabilities in a vacuum. He developed them in a household managed by a man who had spent years doing intelligence work, who had military training, who had learned from professional actors how identity was constructed and performed, and who communicated his understanding of these things to the child in his care, not through formal instruction, but through the ambient example of his daily functioning. Alfred's way of moving through the world, his observational precision, his management of information, his capacity for sustained performance of a professional identity, his ability to assess situations rapidly and respond to them without allowing his emotional responses to compromise the quality of his thinking, was Bruce's primary adult model across the years of his formation, and the degree to which that model shaped what Bruce eventually became is not adequately accounted for in narratives that emphasize Bruce's solitary development at the expense of the relational context in which that development occurred. Bruce left for his years of global training with Alfred's knowledge and Alfred's complex, unspoken blessing. A blessing that was not simple approval of what Bruce was doing, but something more complicated and more honest. The specific blessing of a person who understood what was being set in motion and who had concluded, with reservations that he would carry for the rest of his life, that the alternative to this was worse. Alfred remained at Wayne Manor, maintaining the estate, managing the legal and financial infrastructure that Bruce's prolonged absence required, and waiting with the specific quality of patience that he had developed across decades of professional life. The patience of a person who understands that waiting is itself a form of work, and who brings to it the same precision and the same sustained attention that he brings to everything else. The work that Alfred was doing during those years of Bruce's absence was not only the external work of estate management, it was also the internal work of preparation, the deliberate effort to ready himself for what he would be required to provide when Bruce returned, to build within himself the specific capacities that the coming role would demand. He refreshed his medical training with the systematic thoroughness of someone who understood that field medicine under suboptimal conditions was different from hospital medicine in ways that mattered enormously in practice, and that the gap between what he currently knew and what he would eventually need to know required serious attention. He thought carefully about the psychological dimensions of what he would be supporting, not the romantic image of it, but the actual operational reality, the specific physical costs and psychological pressures that sustained exposure to the conditions Bruce was preparing to inhabit would generate, and what he might be in a position to do about those costs and pressures from the inside of the operation, rather than the outside. He prepared, in the specific and serious way that his background had taught him preparation was the difference between effective performance and inadequate response, for a situation whose full dimensions he could anticipate only partially, and whose actual demands he would discover only in the encountering. The man who met Bruce Wayne at the door of Wayne Manor when Bruce returned from his years of training was not the man who had managed Bruce's childhood in the immediate aftermath of the murders. He was older and had been changed by the specific quality of the waiting, by the particular form of preparation he had undertaken, by the continued accumulation of the understanding that his relationship with Bruce was the central fact of his existence, in a way that he had not entirely anticipated when he had assumed his obligations to the family years before. He was ready, in the ways that a person can be ready for things they have prepared seriously for. He was not ready, in the ways that a person cannot be ready for the specific reality of what they have only been able to anticipate. Both of these things were true simultaneously. and Alfred moved forward into the situation they described with the equanimity that was his most consistent professional expression, and the specific quality of controlled anxiety that was its constant companion. Visible only to those who knew him well enough to see beneath the surface he maintained with such consistent skill. The cave beneath Wayne Manor was not Alfred's idea, and was not built with Alfred's specific assistance in any of the technical senses that the mythology sometimes suggests. But it was Alfred who made the cave functional as a sustained operational base, rather than a dramatic gesture, who identified and addressed the logistical deficiencies that Bruce's initial enthusiasm had overlooked, who established the maintenance schedules and the supply systems and the organizational structures, without which the most sophisticated equipment becomes gradually unreliable and then non-functional. Alfred brought to the cave the same professional intelligence that he had always brought to the spaces he managed, understanding that the quality of a space was not determined by the aspirations of its creator, but by the sustained attention of whoever was responsible for its upkeep, and that sustained attention was the specific thing he had to offer at a level that no one else in Bruce's life could provide. The Batsuit in its early iterations required maintenance that its designer had not fully thought through, regular cleaning and repair and testing that the specific conditions of its use made both urgently necessary and technically demanding. Alfred taught himself what the suit's materials required and provided it, developing as he went the specific expertise that the specific situation demanded. The vehicles required mechanical maintenance that Alfred's background had not specifically prepared him for, but that he addressed with the same systematic self-directed learning that he brought to every gap between what he knew and what the situation required. The medical supplies required sourcing through channels that could not raise questions. Alfred was not in a position to answer, and Alfred developed and maintained those channels with the tradecraft discretion that his intelligence career had made second nature. He established the routines that the operation depended on, the preparation before Bruce left for each night's work, the waiting during the hours when Bruce was in the field, the immediate response when Bruce returned, which might require anything from a warmed meal to emergency surgery performed in a cave with equipment that most operating theaters would have declined to characterize as adequate. He performed all of these functions with a consistency and a precision that the operation required, and that required, in turn, a specific form of psychological management that Alfred never discussed with anyone because there was no one available to discuss it with. He was carrying the sustained weight of participation in an enterprise whose risks were extreme and whose potential consequences for Bruce and for Alfred and for the people of Gotham, whose protection was the enterprise's stated purpose, were never far from Alfred's awareness. He carried this weight with the professional equanimity that his role required, and with the genuine fear underneath it that his honesty required him to acknowledge to himself, even when his professionalism required him to conceal it from everyone else. The intelligence function that Alfred contributed to Batman's operation was perhaps the least visible of his contributions, precisely because it required no dramatic demonstration. It operated through the quality of the information available to Bruce, through the relationships Alfred maintained in Gotham's social and institutional landscape that provided access to knowledge that more aggressive intelligence-gathering methods could not readily obtain, through Alfred's specific capacity to read people and situations with the precision that years of professional observation had developed. Alfred knew Gotham's social infrastructure in the particular way that a person knows a city when they have inhabited it for decades, with the consistent attention of someone whose role required them to understand who people were, how they related to each other, and what the dynamics of their relationships implied for the management of the household those people intersected with. This knowledge was not trivial. It was the knowledge of a skilled intelligence professional who happened to also know which fork went where and how to remove a red wine stain from antique linen. And both bodies of knowledge were available to Bruce in ways that their relationship made possible, and that no other relationship in Bruce's life replicated. The medical function is the one whose significance is most immediately legible, because its necessity is most obviously non-negotiable. Batman operated without access to conventional medical care for injuries that would have brought any ordinary person to hospital, because hospital visits left records, and records created vulnerabilities that the operation could not tolerate. Alfred filled the gap that this created, filled it with the specific combination of formal medical training, field medicine experience, self-directed study, and the particular quality of calm under pressure that emergency medical situations demand, and that most people who have not practiced emergency medicine under genuine emergency conditions cannot sustain. He sutured wounds that surgeons would have addressed in operating theaters with better lighting and better instruments and the support of trained staff. He managed infections with pharmaceutical resources that he had sourced through professional relationships that required careful management. He assessed injuries whose severity was not always immediately apparent and made judgments about treatment protocols whose accuracy had consequences measured in Bruce Wayne's continued ability to function or his failure to do so. He was very good at this. He was very good at it because he had understood from the beginning that it was the function whose failure would be most immediately catastrophic, and he had prepared for it accordingly. The psychological function, Alfred's role, as the one person in Bruce's life who knew both identities simultaneously, and who could therefore engage with Bruce in ways that addressed the full reality of what he was, is the most difficult of his contributions to quantify, and the one whose significance is perhaps most profound. Bruce Wayne operated in a world of managed partitions, relationships organized around what could be known and what could not, around the specific information that each relationship's parameters permitted, and the larger reality that each relationship's parameters required to remain concealed. Every relationship in Bruce's life, with the exception of his relationship with Alfred, was a relationship conducted through a particular version of Bruce, rather than through the whole of what Bruce was. Alfred was the exception because Alfred had been given the whole picture, not given it as a gift, but given it as a necessity, because the operation required someone with full information to function at all, and the only person Alfred could be was Alfred. He held that full picture across decades with the discretion of someone who understood both its value and the weight of holding it. And he made available to Bruce the specific relief of being fully known by at least one person in the world, a relief whose significance, in a life organized around the systematic management of what others could know, was not adequately expressible in any language available to either of them. The relationship between Alfred Pennyworth and Bruce Wayne is one of the most significant relationships in the mythology that contains them, and its significance is not adequately captured by any of the categories that language has developed for the purpose of describing how human beings relate to one another. It was not a father-son relationship, though it contained more of that relationship's essential substance than many relationships that bear the name legally and formally and without complication. It was not an employer-employee relationship, though Alfred maintained the professional forms of that category with a consistency that reflected both his understanding of its functional value and something more complex about his own psychological relationship to the role the relational forms. Specific comfort that professional framing provided for an emotional reality that the professional framing was not, in the end, adequate to contain. It was not a friendship in any conventional sense, partly because the power differential and the professional context would always organize its expression in ways that conventional friendship did not require, and partly because what Alfred and Bruce had together was something more demanding and more costly than most friendships are, something that required from both participants a degree of sustained commitment that friendship, as ordinarily practiced, does not typically demand. It was something that had grown from obligation and from grief into the central organizing fact of both their lives, something that neither of them had exactly chosen and that neither of them could have relinquished without losing something that had become definitional to who they were. And its resistance to category is part of what makes it worth attending to, with the seriousness that the people inside it deserved. The specific language that Alfred used to navigate this relationship reveals as much about what the relationship was as any direct description of its content. Alfred communicated with Bruce through a mode of indirection that was so consistent and so refined across decades of practice that it would have been easy to mistake it for emotional reserve for the specific English professional. Quality of not saying things directly that a more emotionally expressive culture might have found stifling, but the indirection was not reserve. It was a form of respect, a specific acknowledgement of Bruce's autonomy and of the particular configuration of Bruce's psychology that made direct emotional expression from Alfred something that Bruce would have found more burdensome than comforting, something that would have placed demands on him that their relationship's particular character made it difficult for him to meet. Alfred said, "I am concerned about your well-being by ensuring that the medical supplies were fresh and the food was warm, and the chair by the fire was positioned at the angle that Bruce found most conducive to genuine rest rather than the performance of rest. He said, I know what this is costing you by being present and quiet and not requiring anything from the presence, except that Bruce acknowledge it by sitting down. He said, I love you by attending to everything that love could attend to in the specific register available to them both. And if Bruce understood the communication which he did, because Bruce Wayne was constitutionally incapable of failing to notice precisely the things that most required noticing, then the indirection was not a failure of expression, but its most complete available form. Alfred argued with Bruce. This is perhaps the most important thing to say about their relationship, that the popular conception of it tends to underemphasize the degree to which Alfred maintained, across decades and against the accumulated weight of operational necessity and Bruce's extraordinary force of will, the specific right to tell Bruce when he was wrong and to persist in telling him through the extended sequences of being ignored and overruled and dismissed that telling Bruce he was wrong tended to involve. Alfred argued about rest, about the specific intervals between the body's damage and its recovery that Bruce's operating schedule consistently refused to accommodate. He argued about the partners Bruce took and the way he managed them, about the specific failure of care, that treating intelligent and capable young people primarily as operational assets, rather than as human beings with developmental needs of their own, represented. He argued about the relationships Bruce maintained with people who were not part of the operation, the degree to which those relationships were permitted to be genuine rather than managed, to demand real presence rather than the performed presence of someone whose actual attention was elsewhere. He argued about whether the life Bruce was living was compatible with Bruce's survival, not in the immediate tactical sense that Alfred spent a significant portion of his professional energy addressing, but in the larger and more significant sense of whether there was a person inside the operation who was being sustained rather than gradually consumed by it. He lost these arguments. He lost them with a consistency that would have led any person of lesser conviction or lesser commitment to the specific relationship that made the arguments meaningful to stop making them. Alfred did not stop. He continued to raise the same essential concerns in different forms across the years, adjusting his approach to accommodate Bruce's predictable resistance without adjusting the fundamental content of what he was concerned about, because the fundamental content was correct, and Alfred's commitment to being correct about the things that mattered, which was a commitment that his professional background had made central to his operational identity, overrode his awareness that correctness in this particular domain was not going to produce the changes it advocated for. He made the arguments because they needed to be made, and because he was the only person available to make them, and because making them was itself a form of the relationship whose continuation depended on Alfred's willingness to be honest, even when honesty was inconvenient, and even when it was without practical effect. The knowledge of Bruce's identity, the full picture of who Bruce Wayne was and what he did, and what the relationship between the two faces of that identity actually looked like from close range, was a trust that Alfred held across the entirety of their shared life, with a fidelity that admitted not even the theoretical consideration of its violation. Alfred could have disclosed. There were people who would have paid significantly for the information he possessed, and people who would have felt, with considerable justification, that the information was relevant to their professional or personal responsibilities, and moments in the history of their shared enterprise when Alfred's possession of a secret he was maintaining against significant personal cost might have seemed to a different person to release him from the obligation of maintaining it. Alfred never experienced the release from that obligation as available to him, because the obligation was not a contract whose terms could be renegotiated when the terms became inconvenient, but a commitment whose foundation was the specific trust that Bruce had extended to him and that Alfred had accepted, a trust that could be honored or violated, but not adjusted to suit Alfred's convenience. He honored it continuously and without exception, and at costs that he paid without accounting for them in any way that Bruce was ever permitted to see, because honoring it was not a transaction with visible returns, but a fundamental expression of who Alfred was in relation to who Bruce was. And that expression was not available for revision based on its cost. The specific quality of Alfred's fear for Bruce across the years of the operation's duration is the dimension of their relationship that Alfred managed most completely out of Bruce's awareness, and that cost Alfred most in the long accumulation of its daily weight. Fear for Alfred was not an acute event. It was a chronic condition, the persistent awareness, maintained against the background of every other activity he performed and every other interaction he conducted, that the person he cared for most was engaged in an enterprise whose risks were genuine and whose consequences of failure were permanent. This awareness was not manageable through rationalization, because Alfred was too clear-eyed for rationalization, too thoroughly a professional in the assessment of actual risk to permit himself the comfort of underestimating it. He knew, with the precision of someone who had spent years in the field medicine of the operation's aftermath, exactly what the body was capable of absorbing and exactly where the margins of that absorption lay. And he knew that Bruce consistently operated at those margins, and that operating at margins was a practice whose statistical properties were not kind to anyone who sustained it long enough. He feared Bruce's death with the specificity of someone who understood in physical and medical detail what Bruce's death would look like, and he managed that fear daily and without complaint, and without allowing it to compromise the quality of his performance in any way that Bruce could observe, because allowing Bruce to observe it would have imposed a burden on Bruce that their relationship's particular configuration required Alfred to spare him. Alfred had a vision for what Bruce's life might have contained alongside the mission, a vision not of Bruce abandoning the project that his whole identity was organized around, but of Bruce finding within it, or adjacent to it, dimensions of human life that the project had systematically foreclosed. This was not a naive vision. Alfred was incapable of naivety, which was one of the things that made his tenderness, when it appeared, so entirely credible and so entirely moving. He understood that the specific form Bruce's identity had taken, the degree to which the mission had become not something Bruce was doing, but something Bruce was made, the existence of those other dimensions, structurally, difficult in ways that could not be addressed simply by Bruce choosing to rest more or to form more open relationships. The architecture of what Bruce had built did not easily accommodate the things Alfred wished it could accommodate, and Alfred knew this, and held the wish alongside the knowledge, without allowing either to completely displace the other. He wanted, with genuine and sustained care, for Bruce to be able to experience the dimensions of human existence that Bruce had sacrificed to the mission, and he understood, with the same clear-eyed precision that characterized all his assessments, that wanting this was not the same as it being possible. What Bruce gave Alfred in the specific forms available to their relationship was not nothing, and accounting for the returns of Alfred's sustained investment requires honesty about both what those returns were and what they were not. Bruce gave Alfred purpose that the traditional dimensions of his professional role could not have provided the sense that the specific combination of capabilities he had developed across an unusual and various life was genuinely essential rather than merely useful, that there was no one else who could do what Alfred did in the way that Alfred did it, and that the operation's continuation depended on the specific quality of Alfred's contribution in ways that were not merely flattering assessments, but accurate ones. He gave Alfred, in the continued existence of their relationship across decades of conditions that might have destroyed simpler relationships, the specific gift of being needed in a way that went beyond professional need, being needed as a person, in the full complexity of what a person is, by someone whose own complexity was extraordinary. And he gave Alfred, in the moments that were available for it, the rare moments when the operational pressure relented sufficiently for something more personal to surface, a form of recognition that meant more to Alfred than Bruce ever fully understood, because Alfred consistently managed the visibility of how much the recognition meant, which was its own expression of the care that constituted the relationship's fundamental character. The loneliness that Alfred's role required him to sustain was a loneliness that the role's visible demands made easy to overlook. Alfred was never physically alone in any sustained sense. Wayne Manor was an occupied house. The Batcave was a populated operational space, and Alfred's own social capacities were sufficient to maintain the kinds of surface interaction that his professional role and his position in Gotham's social landscape required. But the specific loneliness of knowing what he knew and being unable to share it with anyone outside the operation, the loneliness of a person who has been given the full picture of something extraordinary and who carries that picture in complete isolation from any community of understanding, was a loneliness that the sustained experience of it did not diminish. Alfred was the only person who knew all of it. No one else carried precisely what Alfred carried or could have understood from the inside, what the carrying required. He was alone with the knowledge in a way that the knowledge's importance made more rather than less isolating, because the more significant the thing one cannot share, the more completely the incapacity to share it separates one from the ordinary communal life of human beings who talk to each other about the things that matter to them. Alfred could not do this. He managed without it, because managing without what was unavailable was one of the things he had always been best at, and the management was real, and the competence it demonstrated was genuine, and the loneliness under it was also real, and was not resolved by the competence. Dick Grayson arrived in Wayne Manor as a child, which meant that he arrived as a challenge to Alfred's existing professional architecture in a very specific and immediate way, a challenge not of logistics, which Alfred could address with the professional competence he brought to all logistical challenges, but of emotional orientation, which required Alfred to expand the already complex relational territory he was managing, to include someone whose needs were different in important ways from Bruce's, and whose presence in the house changed the specific quality of what the house was. Alfred observed Dick Grayson with the same careful attention he had always brought to the people in his care, and what he observed was remarkable in ways that became immediately consequential for how Alfred understood his own role in the expanded household. Dick was resilient in a way that Alfred had not seen before, in the specific context of the Wayne operation, resilient not in the sense of being unaffected by loss, because Dick had lost his own parents, and the loss was real, and its weight was visible, but in the sense of being constitutionally oriented toward connection and toward the continuation of life, rather than toward the particular form of purposeful withdrawal that Bruce's grief had produced. He wanted to be liked, genuinely and without strategic purpose. He wanted to laugh and to play and to experience the dimensions of childhood that the Wayne enterprise and its attendant gravitas consistently threatened to subsume. Alfred found this quality extraordinary, not because it was rare in children generally, which it was not, but because it was rare in the specific environment that Alfred had been managing, which had not previously contained much of it. Alfred's relationship with Dick developed its own specific character quite independently of Alfred's relationship with Bruce, and the independence of it was itself significant. the evidence that Alfred was not simply extending a single relational template to additional people, but adapting his capacity for care to the specific person in front of him, finding in each case the particular form that care took when its object was a specific individual with a specific history and a specific configuration of needs. He was warmer with Dick than he had learned to be with Bruce, more openly expressive, more willing to allow the affection to be visible rather than translated into professional service, and allowed to communicate itself indirectly through the quality of that service. Dick made this possible by being someone who received affection naturally and reciprocated it without complication, who did not experience the expression of care as a demand that required management. And Alfred's response to this ease was the specific relief of a person who had been performing a particular kind of emotional restraint for years, and who discovered in a new context that the restraint was not universally necessary. He allowed himself more with Dick than he had with Bruce. He allowed himself to be simply warm, which was what he was, and which the management of Bruce's particular psychology had made it less consistently possible to be. The advocacy Alfred maintained for Dick within the internal dynamics of the operation was sustained and genuine, and occasionally required Alfred to push against Bruce in ways that their relationship's particular power dynamics made uncomfortable to sustain. Alfred understood things about what Dick needed that Bruce's operational focus consistently threatened to overlook, understood that Dick was a young person in the active process of development, that the specific conditions of the development he was receiving within the Batman operation had implications for the adult he would eventually become, that the optimization of those conditions for operational effectiveness at the expense of Dick's broader human development was a choice with long-term consequences that Bruce's single-mindedness made it easy to minimize. Alfred pushed back against this minimization through the channels available to him, through the consistent and patient reiteration of concerns that Bruce sometimes received and often did not, through the specific form of presence Alfred maintained with Dick that communicated, in its daily texture, a consistent message about Dick's value as a person rather than as a partner. Jason Todd's arrival brought with it a quality of warning that Alfred felt in the specific way that he felt things he had spent years learning to feel through the accumulation of small, observed details into a pattern that his professional assessment of human beings had learned to take seriously even before the pattern had become explicit enough to articulate clearly. Jason was different from Dick in ways that went beyond temperament and personality into something more fundamental about the specific character of the vulnerabilities that each of them carried into the Batman operation. Dick's vulnerabilities had been managed because Dick's resilience and his social intelligence and his genuine warmth had given him resources for managing them that were not dependent on external support. Jason's vulnerabilities were of a kind that depended more heavily on the external, relational environment, on the specific quality of the recognition and the belonging that the environment provided, and the Batman operation was not an environment that had been designed to provide those things consistently, because it had been designed for someone whose psychological architecture did not require them in the ways that Jason's did. Alfred expressed his concerns through the channels that his role and his relationship with Bruce made available, which were the channels of careful and indirect communication that the management of their relationship had established across years of practice. He raised questions that pointed toward the concerns without asserting the conclusions. He observed behaviors and reported them with the specificity of someone who understood that the observations were data points in an argument he was making, even if the argument was not yet made explicitly. He maintained his attention to Jason with a quality of care that was itself a form of advocacy, the sustained demonstration, through the daily texture of his interactions with the boy, that Jason was seen and valued and attended to in ways that the operational context of his role sometimes obscured. None of this was sufficient to change what happened. Alfred knew that it was not sufficient before it happened, and the knowledge of its insufficiency and the impossibility of doing more than what he was doing represented one of the more difficult forms of helplessness that his role required him to sustain, which was the helplessness of someone who can see what is coming and cannot redirect it through any means available to them. The deaths and the recoveries and the crises that the Batman operation generated across the years were not experiences that Alfred underwent once and then incorporated into a stable understanding of what his role required. They were experiences that continued to accumulate, each one adding to the weight of what Alfred was carrying without removing anything from it, because grief of the kind that Alfred's role generated did not resolve through accumulation but intensified, each new loss or near loss making the previous ones more, rather than less, present in Alfred's ongoing awareness of what the enterprise he was supporting was costing. He carried all of it, Jason, and the injuries before and after Jason, and the near misses that Alfred knew about, and the ones he suspected without confirmation, and the ongoing reality of supporting someone in a project whose risks he understood with clinical precision and whose continuation he had chosen to support despite that understanding. He carried it with the equanimity that his role required and with the private weight of everything the equanimity was managing. And the management was never easy, and the equanimity was never effortless, and the professionalism that made both possible was itself a form of sustained heroism that required no less commitment for being unglamorous. Alfred's ethical framework was not an abstract philosophical system, but a practical moral architecture that he had built across decades of experience in contexts that required genuine moral reasoning rather than theoretical contemplation. He had served in military operations whose ethical dimensions were not clear-cut and had been required, in that service, to make judgments about when institutional authority was acting within the bounds of its legitimate mandate and when it was not, and to act on those judgments without the comfort of external validation. He had conducted intelligence work whose relationship to conventional morality was deliberately complicated work that required him to hold the tension between the tactical ethics of effective intelligence practice and the broader ethics of treating people, even adversaries, as human beings deserving of a minimum of consideration. He had observed from close range the ways that professional environments could gradually normalize practices that individual moral reasoning, applied with clear eyes and genuine seriousness, would identify as problematic, and he had developed a specific vigilance against the normalization process, a habit of checking his own practical reasoning against his more fundamental moral commitments to ensure that the former had not gradually drifted away from the latter while his attention was elsewhere. This vigilance was one of the most important things Alfred brought to his role in the Batman operation, because the Batman operation was an environment with significant normalization pressures, an environment in which the urgency of operational effectiveness and the compelling moral purpose of protecting innocent people from those who wished to harm them created conditions in which practices that careful, external moral scrutiny might have found problematic could be experienced internally as simply necessary. Alfred maintained his external moral scrutiny as a deliberate practice, checking the operation's practices against his own ethical framework with a regularity that his presence within the operation made more rather than less difficult, because the person inside a system is always less able to see the system clearly than the person outside it, and Alfred understood this and compensated for it through the specific form of sustained moral self-examination that his background had made a professional habit. The rule about killing Batman's commitment to the principle that lethal force was not an available option in the conduct of his operations was a commitment whose maintenance Alfred supported with a consistency and a seriousness that reflected his genuine understanding of its significance. This was not simply a rule that Bruce had adopted and that Alfred respected as a fact about Bruce's operating parameters. It was a principle that Alfred had his own reasons for valuing, reasons grounded in his own military and intelligence experience, rather than in Bruce's specific psychology. Alfred had seen what happened when individuals arrogated to themselves the authority to make life and death decisions about other human beings on the basis of their own assessments of those decisions. Necessity had seen it in military contexts where the authority was institutionally sanctioned, and in intelligence contexts where it was less formally acknowledged but equally real. He understood the ways in which the exercise of lethal authority changed the person who exercised it, the specific and irreversible quality of the change, the way that certain thresholds, once crossed, reorganized the moral landscape in ways that made subsequent crossings more thinkable and therefore more likely. He cared about this principle, not abstractly, but in the specific and concrete terms of his concern for Bruce's continued humanity. His concern that the thing Bruce was in the process of becoming did not cross into the territory where the humanity that made the mission meaningful was itself lost. The conversations Alfred had with Bruce about the limits of the methods, about where the lines were and why they were where they were, and what the consequences of treating them as flexible would be, were among the most serious conversations of Alfred's professional life, which is to say they were among the most serious conversations of Alfred's life, because the professional and the personal had long since ceased to be meaningfully distinct for him in any domain that involved Bruce. He made these arguments carefully, with the full weight of his experience and his reasoning, and he made them knowing that their reception would depend on variables he could not entirely control, on Bruce's psychological state at the time of the conversation, on the specific operational pressures that were bearing on Bruce in that period, on the degree to which Bruce's trust in Alfred's judgment happened to be accessible in the form the conversation required. Sometimes the arguments landed, sometimes they were acknowledged and then not acted on. Sometimes they were met with the specific form of dismissal that Bruce's impatience with challenges to his operational framework occasionally produced. Alfred made them regardless, because the arguments needed to be made, and because not making them would have represented a failure of Alfred's own moral responsibilities that his commitment to his own ethical framework would not permit. Alfred's broader assessment of Batman's methods, of the full range of approaches that the operation employed and the full range of their consequences, was honest in ways that his continued participation in the operation might have seemed to preclude. He had reservations. He maintained them across the years of his involvement, revising them as new evidence required revision, but not abandoning them, because the evidence of his direct experience had become so extensive that the reservations had ceased to feel theoretically grounded and had become instead product of observed reality. He had watched what sustained exposure to violence and its management did to Bruce over time, had observed the specific ways that decades of the operation had shaped and constrained and in some respects diminished the range of what was possible for Bruce as a person, making some things more accessible and other things progressively less so. He had observed the degree to which the operation's existence had contributed to the escalation of Gotham's criminal environment in ways that the operation's protective function made it easy to overlook, but that Alfred's clear-eyed assessment of the evidence was not able to entirely discount. He held these observations and continued his participation in the operation simultaneously, because his assessment of the alternatives of what Gotham and Bruce and the people around Bruce would face in the operation's absence continued, despite everything, to support the conclusion that continuation was the better of the available choices. He reached this conclusion not comfortably, but with the specific discomfort of genuine moral reasoning, which was the only form of moral reasoning Alfred had ever trusted. The question of Alfred's own complicity in the costs that the operation extracted from the people within and around it was a question Alfred did not resolve into comfort at any point in his life that the evidence allows us to see. He understood that his support for Bruce's mission made him, in some meaningful and non-trivial sense, responsible for the conditions that the mission created for the exposure of Bruce's partners to the specific risks and costs that participation in the operation involved, for the effects on Gotham's criminal ecosystem that the operation's existence contributed to, for the personal costs that Bruce paid in the currency of human connection and rest, and the dimensions of human life that the mission had progressively excluded. He understood all of this and continued his participation because he had concluded that the alternative was worse, and he held the question of whether that conclusion was correct as a live and genuine question rather than a settled one. Because honest intellectual life required him to hold it that way, and because Alfred had never found the alternative to honest intellectual life, the comfortable foreclosure of genuine questioning in favor of settled conviction, to be available to him as a psychological option. He was too honest for that kind of peace, and the specific quality of his moral life was shaped by that incapacity, which was also an integrity. The crisis that came closest to breaking Alfred Pennyworth, to reaching the place beneath the professional equanimity and the sustained competence and the managed fear, and producing something that could not be managed back into. Functionality was not the crisis that the dramatic logic of the Batman mythology would have predicted. It was not a night when Bruce did not return, though there were nights when the hours stretched past every anticipated threshold, and Alfred's knowledge of the field medicine that might be required translated itself, moment by moment, into increasingly specific and increasingly alarming assessments of what might be waiting when the return finally happened. It was not a single catastrophic injury, though there were injuries whose severity tested the limits of what Alfred's field medicine could address, and whose treatment in the cave required Alfred to perform functions under emotional conditions that no operating theatre protocol was designed to accommodate. It was not even the broader and more diffuse crisis of watching a person he loved consume themselves in a project whose costs were accumulating in ways that Alfred's clinical observation could track with painful precision. The crisis that came closest was a specific one, and it was specific because it was about a specific child, and the child was Jason Todd, and the specific quality of Alfred's grief for Jason was different from every other form of grief Alfred had managed in his long acquaintance with loss, because it carried within it the weight of a warning that had been given and received and not acted on, and the knowledge of that sequence, the specific knowledge that the warning had been insufficient and that the insufficiency had contributed to the outcome, was the dimension of the grief that Alfred could not process through any of the mechanisms that had served him across decades of managing things that required managing. Alfred had known Jason Todd was in danger in the specific and professional sense of knowing, not in the vague and abstract sense of worrying, which was a condition that Alfred's role maintained continuously, and which he had developed the capacity to distinguish from more operationally significant forms of concern, but in the precise and evidence-based sense of a person who has assembled observations into a pattern and assessed that pattern against his understanding of the environment. The pattern was operating within and arrived at a conclusion whose implications were clear and whose urgency was high. He had communicated the concern through every channel available to him. He had watched the concern be received, processed through Bruce's particular framework for assessing input about partners and about operational risk, and filed in the category that Bruce's operational confidence reserved for concerns he judged to be overstated. Alfred had been wrong about things before. The history of his long professional relationship with Bruce contained a record of concerns he had raised that had not eventuated into the consequences he had feared, and he understood that Bruce's assessment of his concerns had to account for that record alongside the record of concerns that had been borne out. He understood the logic by which Bruce had concluded that this concern, like some previous concerns, was something Alfred's tendency to prioritize Bruce's welfare over operational necessity had caused him to overweight. He understood the logic, and he thought the logic was wrong, and he was right that it was wrong, and being right about it in the aftermath of Jason's death was the specific form of correctness that Alfred found most difficult to carry across the years that followed. The grief he felt for Jason was the grief of someone who had watched a child die, not metaphorically, but in the most direct and specific sense available to someone whose physical presence at the moment of death was not possible, and whose knowledge of what had happened arrived through channels that Alfred's intelligence background made unusually reliable. He had cared for Jason in the specific and daily way that his role permitted the meals, the conversations that Alfred had managed to sustain at the precise level of engagement that Jason's specific emotional needs had seemed to require without overstepping the boundaries that the professional configuration of their card interaction technically imposed. He had liked Jason as a person, liked his specific quality of anger, which was the anger of someone whose intelligence had consistently encountered a world whose actual organization bore insufficient relationship to the principles it claimed to operate by, and whose response to this encounter was the specific heat of genuine moral feeling rather than the cold calculation of someone who had simply decided that the rules were there to be ignored. Jason had cared about what was right. He had cared in the particular and complicated way of someone whose life had given him abundant evidence that what was right was not reliably what happened. And Alfred had recognized in that quality of caring something that the Batman operation could accommodate in certain of its expressions and destroy in others. And the expressions that destroyed it were the ones Jason had encountered. Alfred's response to Jason's death in the period immediately following it was the response of a professional, performing his functions with the precision that his role required, while managing internally something that had no professional expression adequate to its actual weight. He continued to maintain Wayne Manor. He continued to prepare the Batcave. He continued to provide Bruce with the logistical and medical and psychological support that the operation required, and that Bruce's own grief, which was real, whatever one might say about its management, made more rather than less necessary in that period. He did all of this, and he did it well, and under the professional execution of all of it was something that he did not permit himself to express through any of the channels that professional execution kept closed, because the channels were closed for reasons that remained valid even when what they were containing was grief of this specific and heavy kind. He expressed it instead in the private space of his own interior, in the specific and thorough quality of the reckoning he conducted with the sequence of events that had produced the outcome, in the honest assessment he made of the roles that each participant's choices had played in producing it, including his own role, and the specific ways in which what he had done had been insufficient to the task. He did not protect himself from this reckoning. He had never protected himself from honest reckoning, because his entire professional life had been built on the conviction that accurate assessment of outcomes was the only reliable foundation for learning from them, and that learning from outcomes required acknowledging what had produced them with a precision that comfortable self-protection systematically undermined. He assessed what had happened with the full clarity available to him, assigned responsibility, including his own share of it, with the honesty that clarity required, and then continued to perform his functions with the precision that continuing to perform them required, because the alternative to continuing was not available to him, and because the people who depended on his continued performance, beginning with Bruce, who was managing his own grief in the specific and characteristically isolated way that Bruce managed things, could not afford the cost of Alfred's inadequacy at this particular moment. The Nightfall crisis tested Alfred in a different register, not the register of grief, which Alfred had become, through long and painful practice, genuinely skilled at sustaining without its compromising his functional effectiveness, but the register of pure medical emergency conducted under conditions that would have challenged far more fully resourced practitioners than Alfred had ever claimed to be. Bane's defeat of Bruce was comprehensive in the most physically specific sense, the shattering of the spine in a confrontation that Alfred had not been present for, and that he learned about not through official channels but through the evidence of what was returned to him, which was a man whose physical condition represented the kind of damage that a clinical assessment would have categorized without ambiguity as requiring immediate surgical intervention in a facility equipped for spinal surgery, which was not a description that applied to any aspect of the resources available in the Batcave. Alfred made the assessment and then did what Alfred always did when the resources available were insufficient to the task. He did not conclude that the task was therefore impossible, but instead determined what the best possible outcome was given the actual resources and applied everything he had toward achieving it. He stabilized Bruce with the precision that field medicine under these conditions required. He managed the acute crisis with the specific combination of clinical knowledge and practical improvisation that years of addressing the medical aftermath of the Batman operation had developed in him. And he watched Bruce, across the agonizing duration of the recovery, demonstrate the specific and characteristic refusal to allow the body's actual limitations to determine the scope of what he attempted, which was simultaneously the quality that had made Bruce what he was and the quality that made him most difficult to protect from himself. Alfred had opinions about the recovery timeline. He expressed these opinions through every channel available to him. He watched Bruce's assessment of when he was ready to return differ from Alfred's assessment by a margin that their subsequent conversations confirmed was not a difference of information. Bruce possessed the same clinical information Alfred possessed, because Alfred provided it, and Bruce received it with his characteristic comprehensive attention, but a difference of weight, of how much authority the information was granted in the decision-making process relative to other considerations that Bruce was bringing to bear. Alfred continued to provide the information and to advocate for his assessment of what the information meant, and to lose the argument about what Bruce chose to do with it, because this was the pattern of their interaction in the domain of Bruce's physical welfare, and the nightfall recovery was not going to be the occasion on which the pattern changed. He managed his response to losing the argument with the equanimity that his role required, and with the genuine and specific fear underneath the equanimity that his honesty required, and he continued to provide the best possible medical support for decisions he did not endorse, because providing that support was what his presence in the operation meant, and his presence in the operation was not something he was prepared to withdraw simply because it required him to support decisions whose wisdom he disputed. The moments when Alfred left the periods in the history of his relationship with Bruce, when the accumulation of costs and the specific nature of Bruce's choices in particular periods exceeded what Alfred was willing to continue. Supporting and produce the response of departure rather than continued management are among the most revealing aspects of Alfred's character, precisely because they demonstrate the specific nature of his commitment to the relationship and the operation, which was the commitment of a person who had chosen his role freely and who retained the right and the capacity to unchoose it when the exercise of that right seemed to him to be morally required. Alfred's departures were not dramatic rejections. They were not the bitter endings of relationships that had exhausted their emotional resources or the calculated withdrawals of someone who was using absence as leverage. They were the specific response of a person with genuine moral agency who had reached a point where the continuation of his support for a particular direction of the operation or a particular configuration of Bruce's choices required him to suppress his own moral judgment in ways that his commitment to his own ethical framework would not permit. He left when he concluded that staying required a form of complicity he was not willing to provide. He left with the specific quality of sorrow of someone who understands exactly what the leaving costs and who is leaving anyway because the cost of not leaving is higher. He came back when circumstances changed sufficiently to make his return consistent with the principles whose maintenance had required his departure, and he came back without fanfare and without extracting acknowledgements of the grievances that had produced the leaving, because coming back was not a transaction, and his return was not a negotiating position, but simply the resumption of the relationship whose continuation was the most important thing in both their lives. And important things did not require dramatization to justify themselves. The specific fear of losing Bruce, the fear that on any given night, the person Alfred had spent decades caring for and protecting and arguing with and being wrong with and being right with and loving in all the specific and daily, the forms that love took in the register available to them, would go out and not return. was a fear that Alfred managed as a continuous background condition of his existence across every year of the operation's duration, and that did not diminish as the years passed. One might have expected the fear to diminish to be metabolized by the accumulated evidence of Bruce's extraordinary survival across decades of engagement with opponents and conditions that should statistically have produced fatal outcomes far sooner than they had. One might have expected Alfred's clinical assessment of the situation to eventually settle into a kind of resigned confidence that Bruce's capabilities were sufficient to manage whatever he was likely to encounter, that the margins that had sustained him this far were likely to continue sustaining him, that the fear was at some point an over-calibrated response to an actual risk, whose true magnitude Alfred's emotional investment was distorting upward. Alfred was too honest for this kind of comfort. He understood the statistical properties of sustained engagement with genuine risk too clearly to permit himself the reassurance that survival to a given point predicted continued survival beyond it. He continued to be afraid, with the specific and accurate fear of a person who has correctly assessed what the situation contains and who has not permitted themselves the comforting inaccuracies that might have made the fear more manageable. He managed it without complaint and without allowing it to compromise the quality of his performance in any way that Bruce was ever permitted to see. And the sustained performance of equanimity over a sustained experience of fear was itself a form of the courage that Alfred's role required, and that his role's apparently domestic character made easy to overlook. Alfred Pennyworth died, in the canonical account that constitutes the Arkham universe's final reckoning with everything that Batman's war had cost. Inside Wayne Manor, the house he had maintained across decades, the physical space that was more thoroughly his than any other place he had inhabited, the domestic architecture of the enterprise he had spent his life supporting. He died as a result of violence, organized specifically around the principle that Batman could be broken by breaking the things and the people closest to him, which was an argument that the Scarecrow had made through the medium of chemical fear, and that was made here through the medium of Alfred's physical mortality. And the argument was correct in the specific and devastating sense that losing Alfred broke something in Bruce that all the previous losses and all the previous injuries and all the previous encounters with the limits of what he could protect and sustain had not broken in exactly the same way or to the same degree. This was not incidental. The people who organized Alfred's death understood what they were doing in the specific and targeted sense of understanding that Bruce Wayne's vulnerability to Alfred's loss was qualitatively different from his vulnerability to other losses, because Alfred was not a partner or an ally or a friend, but something more foundational, the person whose knowledge of the full picture made him the only relationship in Bruce's life that was not organized around what could not be known, and the loss of that relationship, therefore, did not simply remove one person from Bruce's world, but removed the only version of the world in which Bruce was fully present, rather than partially performed. The specific manner of Alfred's death in this, telling the setting of it, the timing of it relative to Bruce's operational commitments, the impossibility of Alfred's being reached or protected in time, served the Arkham narrative's argument about the ultimate costs of Batman's existence in Gotham with a precision that the narrative had been building toward for the full duration of its telling. Alfred was the person whose proximity to Bruce made him a target in ways he had always understood and had always chosen to accept as the cost of remaining where he was and doing what he did. His death was not a surprise in the structural sense, because the structural logic of his position had always made it a possibility whose actualization was deferred rather than foreclosed. But the actualization of a long-deferred possibility is not made easier by the deferral, and the specific quality of Bruce's encounter with Alfred's death in the manor where Alfred had maintained his life and his presence and his care across the full extent of their shared history was one whose emotional weight narrative handled with as much honesty as it could muster, which was considerable. The alternative canonical accounts of Alfred's death, the stories in which Bane kills Alfred, as an explicit act of war against Bruce's personal connections, as an operationally targeted elimination of someone whose value to Bruce was understood and exploited, represent a different, specific form of the same structural truth. Alfred was vulnerable because he was important, and he was important in a way that his formal role butler to Bruce Wayne, domestic professional in the service of a household, was systematically insufficient to communicate. The various versions of his death are unified by this structural truth regardless of their narrative specificities, and the truth they share is more significant than the differences between them. That Alfred's life in proximity to Bruce's mission was a life conducted at genuine risk, that the risk was one Alfred had assessed and chosen to accept rather than to avoid, and that the acceptance of the risk was itself a form of the devotion that constituted the relationship's most fundamental character. What Alfred's death meant for Bruce in the immediate aftermath, the specific quality of the loss as Bruce experienced, it was not easily reducible to the categories that loss ordinarily occupies in accounts of grief. Losing Alfred was not like losing a parent, though the experience of losing Alfred reactivated in Bruce the specific quality of the loss of Thomas and Martha Wayne in ways that complicated and deepened what he was managing. It was not like losing a partner, though Alfred had been the partner in the most substantive sense of the word, the person without whose sustained contribution the enterprise could not have been what it was, and the operational loss was real and significant. Alongside the personal one, it was most specifically like losing the relationship in which Bruce Wayne was fully and completely known, the one person in the world who held the whole picture, who had seen both faces of the identity simultaneously and without the mediation of either, who could engage with Bruce in the complete reality of what he was, rather than any carefully managed version of it. The loss of that relationship was not replaceable by any other relationship, because no other relationship occupied the same structural position, no one else had been given the full picture, and no one else carried the specific history of Bruce's full reality across the decades of observation and participation that Alfred had accumulated. Bruce was, after Alfred's death, the only person alive who knew the full story of what Bruce Wayne actually was, and the loneliness of that singular knowledge which Alfred had also carried, and whose carrying Alfred had managed without complaint and without ever making it Bruce's problem to solve, now became Bruce's alone to sustain. The preparation that Alfred had conducted for his own death, the notes written and sealed, the arrangements made, the specific organizational logic applied to the disposition of his knowledge and his care in ways that would allow that care to continue in some form beyond his physical presence, was perhaps the most characteristic expression of Alfred's approach to all of the responsibilities he had ever assumed. He had never left things unattended that his attention could address. He had never allowed the future to arrive without having done what was possible to prepare it for the people who would inhabit it. His death was managed, in advance, with the same professional intelligence he had brought to everything else, the understanding that the transition from his presence to his absence was a logistical challenge, whose effects on the people he was leaving behind could be partially mitigated by the quality of the preparation he had undertaken before the transition occurred. The people who found what Alfred had prepared in the aftermath of his death found evidence not of a person who had been surprised by the possibility of his own mortality, but of someone who had lived in ongoing awareness of it and had used that awareness as a motivation for ensuring that what he had built would be as complete and as well organized as possible when the building was no longer available to him. The legacy that Alfred Pennyworth left behind is not the legacy of the great historical actors, the people whose names appear on buildings and in the official records of events that shaped the visible course of things. Alfred's name appears on no building. His contributions to the outcomes that his life made possible are systematically underrepresented in the accounts of those outcomes, because the nature of his contributions was the nature of foundations essential, invisible from the surface, comprehensible only to those who understand that surfaces are sustained by things beneath them, that the surfaces themselves do not reveal. His legacy is visible not in monuments, but in the specific ways that the people he had shaped continued to move through the world after his death, carrying in their capabilities and their orientations and their specific relationships to care and to excellence and to the management of their own moral lives, the permanent marks of his sustained influence. Dick Grayson's capacity to form genuine human connections while operating in an environment that systematically discouraged them, his ability to be both competent and warm, to bring his full humanity into spaces where the operational logic favored its suppression, reflects Alfred's direct and sustained advocacy for that capacity during the years of Dick's development within the Batman operation. The consistent message that Alfred's daily practice with Dick had communicated about the value of emotional availability as something to be maintained rather than abandoned. Barbara Gordon's specific quality of resilience in the aftermath of her injury, her ability to transform what had happened to her into a different and, in certain respects, more powerful form of capability rather than a permanent subtraction, reflects something of the example Alfred had provided across his career of someone who had consistently converted personal cost into professional excellence, who had never permitted what things had taken from him to define the limits of what remained available. Tim Drake's intellectual seriousness, his understanding that genuine intelligence is an obligation to be discharged through careful and honest application, rather than a capacity to be deployed for personal advantage, reflects the specific quality of intellectual life that Alfred's sustained presence as the most thoughtful and most rigorously honest person in the immediate environment had modeled across the years of Tim's development around the Wayne household. The domestic culture that Alfred created in Wayne Manor across the decades of his tenure is itself a form of legacy whose significance is easy to overlook precisely because its character was domestic, because the things Alfred attended to were the things that sustain life at its most daily and its most unglamorous. The meals and the cleaned wounds and the maintained spaces and the consistent quality of presence that made the manor a place rather than simply a structure. Alfred made Wayne Manor a home in the specific sense in which homes are distinguished from mere residences by the sustained attention of someone who understood that the quality of the daily environment in which people lived had consequences for who those people were and who they could become. The people who inhabited that environment during Alfred's tenure were shaped by it in ways they would not have been shaped by a less carefully maintained and less genuinely attended to domestic space. And the shaping was real, even when it was invisible. And the invisibility was itself a feature of the quality of what Alfred had done, the specific professional excellence that achieved its effects without drawing attention to the effort they required. The model of service that Alfred's life represented, and it is worth naming it as a model rather than simply as an individual's particular practice, because its implications extend beyond the specific circumstances of Alfred's specific situation into something more broadly applicable about how to inhabit a position of devotion without losing oneself in. It was a model whose essential features were the maintenance of genuine moral agency within a relationship of profound loyalty, the insistence that love and service did not require the suppression of one's own judgment about what was right, but rather demanded its most rigorous application, and the specific quality of daily attention to the needs of the people one was responsible for that made the large and dramatic expressions of devotion possible by attending to everything those expressions depended on and took for granted. Alfred served in this sense, not in the diminished sense of subordination, but in the complete sense of devoted capability, applied with both excellence and integrity to the welfare of people who needed it and his service in. This sense was among the more remarkable things that any person in the mythology surrounding him accomplished. Remarkable not despite its unglamorous dailiness, but because of it. Because unglamorous dailiness sustained across decades, and without complaint, and without the recognition that other forms of commitment received, is one of the most demanding things that a human life can contain. The question that Alfred's life poses, without answering the question of whether his choice to support Bruce's transformation into Batman, rather than to redirect it more forcefully towards some less costly version of adulthood was the right choice, remains a genuine question rather than a settled one. The evidence that the choice produced enormous good is real and substantial. The evidence that the choice produced enormous cost to Bruce and to the people around Bruce and to Alfred himself is equally real and equally substantial, and the two kinds of evidence do not resolve into a simple verdict any more easily at the end of the accounting than they did at the beginning. Alfred lived with this irresolution, holding the question as a genuine question, rather than as one whose answer he had arrived at, and then defended against the continuing challenge of evidence. Because genuine moral seriousness required him to hold it that way, and because Alfred had always brought genuine moral seriousness to the things that required it, even when, especially when the things that required it were the things that mattered most to him. What Alfred knew, and what his life demonstrates for those willing to read it carefully enough, is something about love in difficult circumstances that does not resolve into sentiment, but remains, beneath all the complexity and all the cost, something that deserves the name. He knew that love, in its most complete and most demanding form, is not the feeling of love, but its practice, not the state of caring, but the daily enactment of that caring through the thousand small attentions and the sustained presence and the maintained competence and the honest advocacy and the specific courage of continuing to show up when showing up continues to be hard. He knew that love of this kind was not adequately rewarded by the systems of recognition that organized the more visible kinds of achievement, and that this inadequacy was not an argument against it, but simply a fact about the territory it occupied. He knew that the person who attends to the small things with the full weight of their capability and their conscience is doing something that matters as much as the person who attends to the large and visible things, and that the mattering is not diminished by the invisibility. He knew all of this, and he lived it, continuously and imperfectly and without complaint, across the full extent of a life that was remarkable, not for its drama, but for its sustained quality of presence in the service of something he had concluded was worth the cost of serving it. Rest now, dear listener, and let the long quiet of Alfred's vigil settle over you like candlelight settling into a room that has been carefully prepared for your arrival. The story we have walked through tonight is the story of someone who kept the watch so that others could sleep, who attended to the details of the darkness so that the people he loved could continue to move through the world without being consumed by it. There is a meal kept warm somewhere in the distance of the story's remaining warmth. There is a light left on, not because it is needed, but because the person who left it on knew that returning to a lit space was different from returning to darkness, and that the difference was worth the attention it required. Alfred Pennyworth knew this. He knew it every day of the long and costly and quietly extraordinary life he chose to lead, and the knowing shaped everything he did with that life, and everything he did with it mattered. Close your eyes now, wanderer. The manor is tended. The night is held at bay by someone who understood that holding it was the work, and who brought to the work everything he was, without reservation and without complaint, and without the expectation of recognition, beyond the specific and sufficient recognition of knowing that the people in his care were safe and resting, and that tomorrow he would do it all. Again, sleep now. Alfred is watching still. The legacy that Alfred Pennyworth left behind does not announce itself the way that most legacies announce themselves, through monuments or institutional endowments, or the kind of documented achievement that the systems designed to track and recognize human contribution were built to register. Alfred left no monument. His name did not appear in the public records of the outcomes that his life had made possible, because his life had been organized around a principle of invisibility, that was not a failure of recognition, but a feature of what he was doing, the specific and deliberate arrangement of things, so that the people who mattered were protected and sustained and enabled, without the mechanism of that protection and sustenance and enablement being visible to anyone for whom its visibility might constitute a vulnerability. Alfred had built a career out of being essential in ways that could not be seen, and the legacy of that career is therefore not easily seen either, which means that understanding it requires the specific kind of attention that Alfred himself had spent his life demonstrating was possible, the attention that looks for what is real rather than what is visible, that understands the surface as a surface rather than as the whole of the thing. The legacy is carried in people, which is where the most important legacies always reside. It is carried in the specific ways that the people Alfred had shaped continued to inhabit the world after he was no longer in it, the particular patterns of thought and behavior and moral orientation that his sustained presence had contributed to forming in them, patterns that persisted and continued to express themselves in their choices and their relationships, and the specific quality of their engagement with the problems that their respective lives continued to present them with. Legacy of this kind is not visible as legacy from the outside, because it has been thoroughly incorporated into the character of the person who carries it. It has stopped being something that was given and has become something that is simply there, part of the operating system rather than a distinguishable application, and this thoroughness of incorporation is itself the measure of its depth. The things Alfred had taught were things that had been learned so completely that the learners had ceased to experience them as learned had ceased to carry them as received instruction, and had begun instead to produce them as natural expression, which is what genuine transmission across the full distance between two people actually looks like when it has succeeded. Dick Grayson carried something specific and identifiable that bore Alfred's mark in the way that the most significant influences bear their marks, not through imitation but through internalization, through the adoption into the self of a principle or an orientation so thorough that its expression in the world looks like the expression of something native rather than something transmitted. Dick's emotional intelligence, his specific capacity to remain genuinely open to human connection in an environment whose operating conditions consistently press toward closure, his ability to be vulnerable and reciprocal in relationships that the Batman operations security logic technically discouraged, was not simply a natural feature of Dick's temperament, though his temperament provided the soil in which it grew. It was a thing that had been tended by Alfred's specific and sustained advocacy for it during the years of Dick's development in and around the Wayne household. His consistent demonstration through daily practice that warmth and competence were not competing values but complementary ones, that the person who could be both proficient and genuinely kind was not compromising one capacity in service of the other, but was operating in the register in which both were most fully themselves. Dick learned this from Alfred in the specific way that important things are learned not in a classroom, not through explicit instruction, but through the accumulated observation of a person whose daily life was a demonstration of the principle being transmitted. Alfred demonstrated it continuously and without fanfare across the full extent of their shared history, and Dick received the demonstration and made it his own and carried it forward into every relationship and every context that his extraordinary life eventually placed him in. Barbara Gordon carried something different, but equally specifically traceable to Alfred's influence. And what she carried was the particular form of resilience that Alfred had himself embodied across decades of sustaining capability and commitment under conditions that systematically tested, both without providing the kinds of support that conventional wisdom about human performance identified as prerequisites for their maintenance. Barbara had watched Alfred function in the Wayne household with the specific clarity of someone whose own intelligence was sufficient to see through the professional surface to the reality beneath it, had understood, in a way that required intelligence and empathy in roughly equal measure, what the professional equanimity was managing and what the management cost and what it meant about the person doing it, that the management was sustained across the full extent of what was required to sustain it. when her own life required her to find the capacity for transformation in the aftermath of catastrophic loss, when the question of whether what remained after the loss was sufficient to constitute a meaningful life became the central, practical question of her daily existence. She had a model available to her that many people in her situation did not have, not a model of cheerful resilience or the denial of what had been lost, but a model of honest and sustained engagement with the full reality of the situation, combined with the specific refusal to permit that reality to become the totality of what defined the future. Alfred had never pretended that what things cost him was less than it was. He had never performed a version of fine that required the suppression of the fine's actual contents. He had acknowledged the costs and continued anyway, with the full weight of the acknowledgement present rather than managed into invisibility. And that specific combination honesty about cost, combined with sustained continuation, regardless of cost, was the model Barbara carried into her own reconstruction of a life and a professional identity after what had happened. To her, Tim Drake had absorbed from Alfred something that was perhaps less dramatic, but no less significant than what Dick and Barbara had received. And what he had absorbed was a particular quality of intellectual seriousness. The understanding that intelligence was not an intrinsic virtue, but an instrumental capacity whose moral character was entirely determined by what one did with it, and that what one was obligated to do with it was apply it honestly and rigorously to the questions that actually mattered, regardless of whether the honest and rigorous application of intelligence to those questions was comfortable or convenient or productive of the conclusions one had arrived at in advance. Alfred had been the most consistently honest and most rigorously self-critical intelligence that Tim had encountered in close proximity during his formative years, and the model of intellectual life that Alfred's daily practice had provided the consistent refusal to protect himself from conclusions that his own reasoning demanded, the specific willingness to hold genuine uncertainty about things that comfort would have preferred to settle, the sustained application of the same critical scrutiny to his own thinking that he applied to every other thinking he encountered, was a model that Tim had received and integrated and continued to demonstrate in the specific quality of his own intellectual life, long after the person who had provided it was no longer available to observe its expression. Even Damian Wayne, the most damaged and the most difficult of all the young people who had come into Alfred's orbit, the child who had been most thoroughly formed by forces that Alfred's influence could only partially counteract, carried something from Alfred that was not nothing. Damian had arrived in Wayne Manor as a person whose moral development had been deliberately distorted, whose relationship to other people had been organized around the principle of hierarchy and utility rather than care and reciprocity, whose default orientation toward the world was the orientation of someone who had been taught to assess every situation and every person in terms of threat and advantage, rather than in terms of the more complex and more human categories that Alfred's domestic culture consistently modeled. Alfred had not transformed Damian. That would be too strong a claim and too neat a conclusion for the messy and difficult reality of what the encounter between Damian's formation and Alfred's presence actually produced. But he had provided Damian with consistent evidence that a different way of inhabiting relationships was possible and was real, had demonstrated through the unchanging quality of his own behavior toward Damian, across the full range of Damian's expressions of the damage that had been done to him. That care that did not withdraw when it encountered difficulty was something that existed in the world, and that Damian was one of its objects, regardless of whether Damian did anything to warrant it. This evidence, accumulated across the time they shared, did not resolve Damian's difficulties, but it established a reference point, an example of something that Damian had encountered and could not unencounter, whose availability in his understanding of what human relationships could be was itself a form of Alfred's legacy, the specific form appropriate to the specific person who received it, The domestic culture that Alfred created and sustained in Wayne Manor is perhaps the least glamorous and most profound dimension of his legacy, and it deserves more specific attention than the general claim of its significance can provide. Wayne Manor, under Alfred's management, was a particular kind of place, not simply a large house maintained to a high standard of cleanliness and organization, though it was certainly that, but a space that communicated, through its physical character and its daily rhythms, something about the relationship between care and physical environment that Alfred understood at a level that went beyond professional competence into something more fundamental. Alfred understood that the places where people lived shaped who they were in ways that went far beyond the merely aesthetic, that the experience of inhabiting a well-maintained, genuinely attended to space, a space that communicated through every aspect of its physical presence, the fact of someone's sustained care, was an experience whose psychological consequences were real and significant and not adequately accounted for in the conversations about human development that focused on the obviously psychological and interpersonal dimensions of experience. He attended to Wayne Manor as an environment that was forming the people who lived in it, and the attention he brought to it was the attention of someone who understood what that formation required, not perfection, which is sterile and intimidating and communicates entirely different things than care, but the specific quality of consistent, intelligent, warm attention that communicated to the people who experienced it that they were worth attending to, that the space they occupied had been considered and maintained with them specifically in mind, that someone was thinking about their comfort and their welfare in the practical and unglamorous terms of a warm meal and a room whose temperature was appropriate, and a chair positioned in relation to the fire in the way that made genuine rest rather than the performance of rest possible. This is Alfred's most fundamental legacy and his most invisible one, the legacy of having been, consistently and across the full extent of his life in that household, the specific quality of presence that its inhabitants could rely on without having to think about relying on it, that sustained the conditions of their lives in the same way that breathing sustains the conditions of biological existence, not noticed, not remarked upon, not the subject of conscious appreciation in most of the moments when its continuity was making everything else possible, but felt immediately in its absence, in a way that made its presence the defining fact of the environment rather than one of its features. Alfred was the heir of Wayne Manor. The people who breathed that air were changed by breathing it, and the change persisted long after the air itself was gone. The central question of Alfred's moral life, whether his decision to support Bruce's transformation rather than redirect it was the right decision, does not resolve. Even at this remove from the events it produced, the evidence for its having been right is real. Gotham is safer for the existence of Batman than it would have been in his absence, and the protection that Batman's existence has provided to people who could not protect themselves is a protection whose value is not adequately measured by any accounting that focuses exclusively on the costs without attending with equal seriousness to the benefits. The evidence against its having been right is equally real. Bruce Wayne lived a diminished life, diminished in ways that Alfred observed clearly and mourned genuinely, and whose diminishment he bore some responsibility for having enabled. The people around Bruce paid prices that their proximity to his mission made inevitable, and that a different set of choices might have spared them. The costs were real, and the benefits were real, and the question of whether the calculation resolved in favor of the choice Alfred made is a question that honest engagement with both sides of it will not settle into a comfortable answer, because comfortable answers to genuinely difficult moral questions are always purchased at the cost of the honesty that makes the answers worth having. Alfred knew this. He held the question as a genuine question for the duration of his life, and brought to it the same quality of sustained, honest attention that he brought to everything that required it, which was everything that mattered to him. He did not find peace about it in the sense of reaching a settled conclusion that removed it from the territory of genuine uncertainty. He found, instead, the specific and more modest peace of a person who has done the honest work that the question required, and has arrived at the best answer available to them, and has acted on that answer, and has continued to hold it accountable to new evidence as the evidence continued to arrive. This is not the peace of resolution. It is the peace of integrity, which is available to people who cannot have the other kind, and which is in its own way sufficient, not comfortable, not final, not protected from ongoing challenge, but sufficient. Rest now, fellow wanderer, in the knowledge that the night is tended. Alfred Pennyworth is the reason that the important things held together long enough to matter, not because he was remarkable in the ways that the mythologies surrounding him tend to obscure, with their attention to more dramatic figures, but because he was present, consistently and completely, and without the requirement of recognition, in all the ways that presence is most necessary and most easily overlooked. He prepared the meals that no one noticed eating because they were simply there when they were needed. He tended the wounds that the mornings after the nights required tending. He maintained the spaces and the systems and the relationships that everything else depended on, attending to them with the full weight of his intelligence and his care across the decades of a life that was organized around the simple and demanding and ultimately beautiful commitment to being where he was needed and doing what was required and asking for nothing in return except the continued opportunity to be useful to the people he had chosen to serve. This is what love looks like when it has been refined through decades of daily practice into its most essential and most unglamorous and most permanent form. Not the love of dramatic sacrifice, which arrives in a single moment and is over. The love of continued presence, of showing up again and again and again, in the cold and the dark and the aftermath of things that had gone wrong, with the meal warm and the light on, and the specific quality of attention that communicated, without words and without ceremony, that the person returning home was expected and valued and cared for, in the specific practical terms of someone who had been thinking about their return and had prepared for it with everything available. This is Alfred. This is what he was and what he did and what he left behind in the people who had the specific and unearned fortune of knowing him. Let his vigil hold you now as it held them, steady and quiet and persistent as candlelight in a room prepared for your arrival, warm against the dark, patient as stone, enduring as care itself. Sleep, wanderer, the watch is kept. It was always kept. It will always have been kept. And the keeping was everything, and the everything was enough.